Okay, Lynn, since you touched on this question, I'm going to mix up the order that I had so carefully established and ask you a question that comes from one of the economists who's associated with the Stanford group, who actually is an expert in international economic law and economic history. And he wanted me to preface his question by saying that even though he happily serves as part of the Stanford group, he teaches at Princeton. And that's who signs his paycheck. What he says is, Lynn, as I'm sure you know, we are about to enter headfirst into a period of even greater deficit mania and demands for austerity. And while it would be nice if this could all be blamed on the Republicans, I think that, in fact, this is a view that is shared by many Democrats, and most specifically by the president. I think that if we watch the activity that comes out of the meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee, we can conclude that Bernanke's view may very well be the consensus of both Washington and Wall Street. But anyone who knows history and just a little bit about economics knows that it's also the exact opposite of the fiscal advice that was offered by one of Bernanke's most effective predecessors. And I'm referring to Mariner Eccles, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve during the 1930s and 1940s. As I'm sure you know, Eccles called for larger deficits and increases in government spending programs to pull the country out of the Great Depression. He then went on to enlist the Federal Reserve to finance the huge World War II debt at low interest rates so that the post-war recovery could flourish. He was proved emphatically right, first in 1937, when the economy fell into a steep nosedive after the Roosevelt administration, based on some bad advice, tightened fiscal policy. And then again, when the massive World War II fiscal stimulus of the 1940s ended the Great Depression once and for all and fueled the highest economic growth rate in American history. And I'm kind of editing this as I speak, but he says fiscal conservatives prefer to ignore the history of the 40s, but it's a period when the Federal Reserve was far more accountable to elected officials and far more independent of the private financial interests that have come to dominate the Fed in more recent days. During the 40s, the federal government spent and borrowed far greater than today as a percentage of overall economic activity. And he notes that today federal spending is about 25% of the GDP, but in the 40s, spending peaked at about 45%. He also said that today the deficit is 9% of GDP. In the 40s, the deficit peaked at 31%. And he goes on to cite other figures. He says, after the war, the policy continued and massive federal spending funded social policy through the GI Bill of Rights, which made available job training, tuition-free education, health care, and housing subsidies to the 16 million returning veterans who represented more than a third of the American workforce. The GI Bill spent a lot of money, but it bolstered an expanding working class and middle class and created the conditions for sustained economic growth. The growing economy pushed up tax revenues, it lowered the debt burden, and it helped the federal government pay down the debt. He says, the fact is that what we did in the 40s, both the spending and the borrowing, was much higher than it is today. There was no rise in interest rates. The Federal Reserve was held accountable to democratically elected officials. It was directed by the White House and the Treasury to peg interest rates at 0.3% on short-term Treasury borrowing and 2.5% on long-term borrowing. The so-called peg period of public finance began in the weeks following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and as the Federal Reserve itself would later describe the division of responsibilities, the amount of government spending was properly determined by Congress, and it was the Treasury's responsibility to determine the rate of interest it would pay on the borrowing. It then became the Fed's duty to purchase government securities in any amount and at any price needed to maintain the interest rate pegs for Treasury. Where am I going with all of this? Well, where I'm going is as follows, he says. He says, many people run around today and scream that we should shut down the Federal Reserve, that the Federal Reserve is illegal, et cetera, et cetera. And perhaps that's true. But the bottom line is that the current reality is starkly different from the reality of the 30s and 40s and the way that the Federal Reserve operated then. Back then, the Federal Reserve supported much higher levels of deficit spending, but they were needed for a recovery at low interest rates. In contrast, today, we have very low interest rates, but they're supporting business as usual in the banking sector, and it is not translating into recovery for the real economy. The Federal Reserve today is not part of the solution, they are part of the problem. Few economists ever learn about this period in Federal Reserve history. It's been airbrushed from most mainstream texts, most especially from Bernanke's own economics textbook. To the extent that the Eccles period is discussed at all, it's dismissed as an odd anomaly. Today's new norm is a Federal Reserve Bank captured by private financial interests that is pursuing an elite agenda of deregulation, fiscal austerity, bailouts, and bonuses for bankers. But our nation's history shows that at one of America's finest hours, it doesn't have to be that way. I raise this very specifically because among the things we have been looking at as part of launching an economic recovery is embarking on the NWAPA program, really the greater NWAPA program that you have proposed. My argument is that the Federal Reserve can play a role in this if we choose for it to play such a role. I'd like your comments on this overall, and later on I know that we will have some more questions for you regarding the whole issue of the federal deficit and whether or not it's something we should worry about.
Well, the thing you didn't mention explicitly, which is crucial to this matter, is take a point of reference. The closest associate and collaborator of the former head of the Treasury was Isaac Roosevelt. And Isaac Roosevelt was the founder of the Bank of New York, and he was the ancestor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Alexander Hamilton's connection is there, and one has to look at this legacy, particularly of the role of Hamilton in defining the U.S. credit and banking policy of the United States, which was absolutely crucial. And the destruction of the United States became essentially, as a system, became essentially the result of Andrew Jackson against the Second National Bank of the United States, which led directly into the Great Panic of 1837. So the problem is that the British interest, and this is what it was. I mean, the British interest was typified by the founding of the Bank of Manhattan. It was founded by the British. And what we call Wall Street today is a result chiefly of the founding of the Bank of Manhattan, which became later Chase Manhattan, right? And that was the opposition to the Bank of New York at that time. Now, Franklin Roosevelt returned to that, as other presidents had also returned to the same policy in later periods. Though the reestablishment of the Bank of the United States, the National Bank, was not restored. And the problem with the Federal Reserve System is that it is not the national bank, but it was created by the Wilson administration on the instigation of the Teddy Roosevelt administration. And this was done to try to destroy the United States' ability to reestablish national banking. And what Franklin Roosevelt did was use the available junk institutions which existed at that time. And through the inauguration of the Glass-Steagall Law in 1933, without the Glass-Steagall Law, there's no understanding of this process in modern times. You have to go back to understand it. You have to go back to the greenback policy under Lincoln. You have to go back to Isaac Roosevelt. You have to go back to Hamilton and to the national banking concept. And that's where the thing is. The key thing here is what is required is the replacement and elimination of monetary systems by a credit system. Because only the control of a currency under the rule of a credit system can handle this problem. And like this question of debt size. All right, now, when you you create debt, well, that does not tell you doesn't answer the questions that are involved, does it? When you create debt as under national banking, you are uttering credit. Let's take the Nawapa project. What we're talking about is, first of all, the United States is going to have to bail out the states. We've got to get the police in place. We've got to get the institutions of state government functioning, the essential social and other institutions of state government. They're collapsing now. And Rand Paul doesn't know about that. He doesn't know about infrastructure. He doesn't understand economics at all. He's an idiot on economics, which helps him to be an assassin in terms of other things. So therefore, you have to understand the American system as it was defined by the constitutional effort to which Hamilton made a great contribution, because Hamilton was the person who organized, as an official at that time, who organized the reform of the banking system of the United States, which led to the adoption of the federal Constitution. The federal Constitution is based on the Hamiltonian principle. And it's what saved the United States at that time was the establishment of that principle. The idea was to free the Americas from the foreign banking influences, to establish a national banking institution which would be able to determine the value of the U.S. currency in its own borders and abroad. No monetarism is allowed. We may have a form of monetarism because it's in the world at large, but we had to defend ourselves against monetarism. And our basic enemy of the United States since 1763 has been the British Empire. The only permanent enemy of the United States is the British Empire, and that's been since 1763, since the Treaty of Paris in February 1763. That's the quarrel. We've got to get rid of the British Empire. Now, Roosevelt had a good idea about how to do that. But Truman was a Wall Street whore. I better explain this because this is crucial and it's important. That when it goes back to 37, and the 37 crisis, Mariner Eccles' role in that crisis. That what happened was that Roosevelt was, in a certain period, the British made a comeback against the Roosevelt reforms after 1936. And this forced the president to back off from his own program and to cut back his own program because he did not have the political power. This was the issue with the Supreme Court reform. Did not have the political power. The Supreme Court was still an agency of the enemy, by and large. So therefore, Roosevelt had to back off at that point and cut back on his reform program for that moment. The British were running high. They were unloosing Hitler on the world. At that time, they were the backers of Hitler. After all, the British Empire created Hitler, and they were his backers. Later, there was a little difficulty came when the France fell, because the Wehrmacht had you heard the French army, the French military vastly massed the German forces at that time. So the Wehrmacht comes running through. How do they conquer France? Well, in the meantime, the fascist government of France had rearranged the military preparations, as well as the commands and so forth, for military forces, which had a vastly superior force to that of the Germans. Why did the Wehrmacht come through? Because the French government opened the gates for the Wehrmacht to overrun France. Now, so this was what was going on. At that point, then Churchill turns around, who'd been out determined, like the British, to destroy the United States, when they thought they had France under control and were going to keep Germany with a war against the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union and Germany were supposed to destroy each other. So the Wehrmacht had an arrangement with the fascist government of France. So the fascist government of France capitulated to the Wehrmacht. And then you had a shift, and then Churchill screams for Franklin Roosevelt to come bail out the British. That's how the change occurred. So this is the background of the situation. So now at this point, when the British had also had the agreement in 1920s for the Japan attack on Pearl Harbor. It was part of a coordinated attack on the U.S. naval forces. So now it's changed. Now Roosevelt is now brought in by Churchill to support the British against the Nazi force in Europe. At that point, the Japanese are stuck because they had been allied with Britain to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. They built the entire fleet operation for the attack on Pearl Harbor in the 1920s. The Billy Mitchell case was a part of this same case. Now suddenly things have changed. Churchill is now screaming for the United States to save the British from the danger that there will be a Western attack on Britain and wipe out Britain. So at this point, the United States is now supporting the Soviet Union's assistance by the aid program. The United States the British are allied with the United States as prisoner because that's the only way they can save themselves with the United States. Japan is stuck. It still has the attack on Pearl Harbor in mind, but it knows it's a potential loser. But they decide to go ahead anyway, even though they knew in the long run they were going to be a loser. So this is what the history has been. Then at the end of the war, Roosevelt dies, and the same bunch of bastards in Wall Street, which had caused this problem in the first place, now come in with Truman, who had been a Wall Street hack. What had happened in 1944, in June of 44, when the United States had led the breakthrough into Normandy, at that point the British changed their policy. And Montgomery was an example of that. They changed their policy. So suddenly Wall Street, which had been, as long as the British were screaming for U.S. help, Wall Street was behaving itself. Truman, who had been a fascist part of the Wall Street operation, had been elected nominated and elected as vice president because the fascists were back in power in Wall Street. They'd been unleashed again. The war in Europe was extended for another 12 months virtually by the British. A surrender of Germany was ready at that point, and the British intervened to have the German generals killed, designated and killed, in order to keep the war going for another year. So therefore we came into completely different conditions at that point. That's been the history. So now what happens is we still have the fixed exchange rate system. We have the Bretton Woods Agreement, which is Roosevelt's creation. The world is still organized for recovery, led by the United States. Now they're out to destroy the United States by the end of the 1950s. At that point, they have a problem. Kennedy is elected, and Kennedy does not act like his father. Kennedy acts as a patriot, which his father was not really too strong on. So Kennedy does a number of things. He defends the steel industry against the steel bosses. And it conducts negotiations. There's an agreement which is the Eisenhower-de Gaulle attempt with Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was a British agent, so that was a real problem. Khrushchev screwed the whole thing up. So now things are going on, and then you got these other developments which ensued, and that's how the history unfolded. So then you had the assassination of Kennedy, which allowed the Vietnam War to occur, and it was the Vietnam War, Indochina War, which for 10 years destroyed the United States. Now the British move in with Nixon, and by the assassination of two Kennedys, which helps this process along, in order to destroy the United States. And what destroys the United States? The British move in with the Inter-Alpha Group, which controls 70% of the world's banking today. The British financial system is the imperial force in the planet today. And my intention is to destroy it. Now, that's the question that's posed really has to be reframed in this context, because the form of the problem is not necessarily the cause of the problem. And addressing the form of the problem will not correct the problem, because it's the cause of the problem you have to deal with. What's the root of the problem? And it's still the same thing today. We're still a fight in the United States since 1782, when the British started the counter-operation against the American Revolution. We're still in that same situation today. And the issue is still the same thing. The Hamiltonian system of a fixed exchange rate system, which is the intention, the idea of our national banking policy, which is the Hamiltonian policy, the idea of a credit system rather than a monetary system. We're now at the point we should realize that after all this experience, we must eliminate the existence of monetary systems from the planet. And we must reestablish credit systems, national credit systems, which are bound together by fixed exchange rate credit systems of agreement. We must organize, for example, let's take the case of this Nuwapa project. This Nuwapa project, we're talking about essentially 30 to 50-year bonding just to get the thing going. Remember, we're going to build, in order to build Nuwapa, we have to build rail lines to carry the heavy freight, which is going into the mountain areas up to 5,000 feet in the Idaho region. And we're going to be hauling this. We're going to build the greatest dams that are ever built. We're going to do more organization of water by far than the Three Gorges Dam. We're going to change the weather system of the world. We're going to take the entire area from the west coast to the 20-inch rainfall line area. We're going to create a new rainfall line area as a byproduct of this water project. We're going to change the character of the planet. We're going to open up the Arctic. We have Russia is deal with the Arctic. The Arctic, Canada, Russia, the United States are the big factors in the Arctic region. We're going to go into this Arctic area which we've never mastered, which has many important features which we have to master. We're going to do these kinds of things. We're going to create a new world system. We're going to connect the entire planet, except for Australia, by railway systems. We're going to solve the problem of Africa, which we begin by the Transaqua policy, which some of the Europeans are opposed to. We have all these means. So what we have to do is when you're looking at the Eccles policy, which has many good features to it, but it's true. But it doesn't bring to the surface what the real deeper issue is, and which Franklin does and the Hamilton view does. And what I'm saying, the time has come, we should learn from our mistakes, the national mistakes and world mistakes. We have to go back to a true American system of political economy, which is based on a global fixed exchange rate system. And the idea of the fixed exchange rate system is to be able to generate long-term public credit for great projects which are needed by mankind over long term at a fixed exchange rate and modest interest charges. And you take this NOAPA project as I outlined it. You're talking about putting, in a very short period, 4 million Americans back to work. 4 million. Not the phony stuff. I mean, right now, the United States and the world is in a general breakdown crisis. The United States is not in a recovery. It's not in this. It's not in that. The United States is on the verge of being totally self-destroyed. Right now. There's no recovery. You continue this, President, there is no United States. There's no financial system. Some people want to negotiate with these guys. I say no. No, the Eccles thing is an important issue, but I think if you look at it the way I've just defined it in broad terms, you get a better understanding of what the issue was at that time, because Eccles was in a period which passed through this period of the Franklin Roosevelt period and the post-Franklin Roosevelt period.